Hi, thanks for choosing Dead Speaks, highlighting crimes, convictions, found dead or still missing. One moment, please.
It started with one death, and within 24 hours, another child was gone. A neighborhood on edge, a family shattered, and at the center of it all, a father who believed justice had failed and took revenge into his own hands. Tonight on Dead Speaks, a teenage boy shot 12 times on the porch. His killer? A man who had just lost his own son. It was the kind of December day that felt more like fall than winter. You know, clear skies, crisp air, a calm before the cold, you might say. And for 14-year-old Jacob Ashford, it was just another ordinary day. He laughed, he danced, he made plans. Jacob was the youngest of 7. His mother called him her bright light, a freshman in high school with big energy and a bigger smile. He was the kid always moving the music only he could hear, always cracking jokes, always bringing life to the room. He wasn't perfect, what 14-year-old is, but he wasn't a troublemaker either. Not in the way some people might assume. He wasn't in a gang, he didn't carry a weapon, but he hung out with other teens who sometimes did. Kids who skipped class, kids who got into things like car break-ins, petty theft. It was a pattern his mother noticed, but one she believed she could still break out of him. Because Jacob had something those other boys didn't seem to. He still had dreams. That afternoon, Jacob made plans to meet up with some friends. Nothing unusual, just another evening in the Wells Goodfellow neighborhood. But while the sun dipped below the rooftops, in another part of the city, something darker was already in motion. And Jacob had no idea that the next 24 hours would be the rest of his life. On December 2nd, 2022, a group of teenagers set their sights on a parked car in North St. Louis. It was meant to be a quick job, in and out, one more joyride in a string of impulsive decisions. Among those teens was 16-year-old LD, Jacob's close friend since childhood. Breaking into a car, taking a joyride. Stupid moves, dangerous moves, but not for them uncommon. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have planned for, was that this time the car wasn't empty. The owner was inside, startled and armed. Police would later confirm what happened next. LD and the other boys approached. There was a confrontation, then gunfire. LD was hit, he collapsed on the pavement, and the others scattered. And though official reports never fully confirmed Jacob's presence that night, there were whispers, rumors in the neighborhood, and even comments from the family that he may have been there. Not in the act, but maybe nearby, possibly riding along, possibly watching it all go down. If true, it meant that when LD was shot dead during the attempted theft, Jacob may have witnessed it, or worse, he may have walked away from the scene that his best friend didn't survive. The man who fired the fatal shot, the car's owner, caught off guard, but legally armed. Police determined it was self-defense. There were no charges, no trial, just a closed file, and one grieving father. Louzell Davis Jr. believed that someone had helped get his son killed, and if he believed Jacob was with him that night, whether involved or just nearby, well, that was all the reason he needed. The next day, December 3rd, 2022, just hours after burying the hopes he had for his son, Louzell Davis Jr. drove to the 5300 block of Northland Avenue, deep in the St. Louis Wells Goodfellow neighborhood. It was a quiet residential street, lined with modest brick homes, some vacant, some worn, but still filled with families trying to keep on. Inside one of those homes, Jacob Ashford was visiting a family friend. Sources later said he had gone there to hang out, a normal Saturday afternoon, maybe to distract himself from the night before, maybe to feel safe. But that safety wouldn't last, because just outside, a man was stepping out of his car, grieving, angry, and carrying a gun. It all happened in seconds. So fast, so brutal. There was no time to run, no time to plead. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, maybe thinking this was just a tense conversation with someone he knew. Maybe he believed he could calm Pops down. But standing just feet away was Louzell Davis Jr., his face tight, his eyes locked on the boy who had once laughed beside his son. Then Davis reached beneath his shirt. The first shot cracked through the cold air. Then another, and another. By the time it was over, 12 bullets had been fired. Jacob collapsed right there on the steps, his blood seeping through the porch wood that still bore the scuff marks of his sneakers. He was unarmed, 14, shot by a man he called Mr. Davis, the father of his closest friend. There was no struggle, no warning, just grief that had turned into rage, and a boy who would never walk back into that family home again. Police were quick to respond. Eyewitnesses placed Louzell Davis at the scene. Surveillance footage in the area and forensic evidence confirmed it. Within days, Davis was arrested. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, armed criminal action, and unlawful possession of a firearm. The case grew local and national attention. Some saw it as a grieving father lashing out. Others called it a premeditated execution. In the end, Louzell Davis Jr. stood before a judge and accepted the weight of what he'd done. He pled guilty, not to first-degree murder, but to a lesser charge, second degree. The court handed down its decision: 17 years for murder, plus 3 years for the armed criminal action, 20 years total. No leniency, no overlap. Every year to be served back to back. Well, for some, it felt like justice. For the Jacobs family, it didn't feel like nearly enough.
In a plea deal, Louzell Davis Jr. pleaded guilty to second-degree murder today for killing 14-year-old Jacob Ashford. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Well, new here at 5, the victim's family says the punishment doesn't fit the crime.
It doesn't seem right. In 17 years, this man can be free after shooting a 14-year-old child, point blank range.
On the steps of the St. Louis Civil Court building Monday morning, the family of Jacob Ashford standing angry and in disbelief over a plea deal for their loved one's killer.
If everybody had did what they were supposed to do, he would have went away forever. At least life without parole.
Jacob's mother said she doesn't agree with the plea deal reached by prosecutors in the case, which reduced the first-degree murder charge against 34-year-old Louzell Davis Jr. to second-degree murder. Davis also pleaded guilty to armed criminal action.
Where's the justice for Jacob?
Jacob was shot and killed in December 2022 in the Kingsway East neighborhood. Trina Hicks says her family knew Davis well. His kids played with her son. Judge Madeline O'Connelly seemed critical of the plea deal, saying 100 years wouldn't be enough.
She felt my pain. She understood that, and she understood once she read the case. She's looking at the nature of the case and seeing that you killed a kid. You know, like, she's probably thinking to herself, like, how was he getting a plea deal?
But the family now faces the reality their son's killer will possibly get out in 17 years after already serving some of his 20-year sentence.
Jacob's dead. He never gets to see 17 years old, but he gets free in 17 years. His plea deal means nothing.
The question that still lingers, one that haunts this case, is simple and yet impossible to answer with certainty. Why Jacob? He didn't pull the trigger that killed David's son. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't even confirmed to be there that night. So why him? The only connection was loyalty. Jacob and LD weren't just friends. They were like brothers. They had grown up side by side, shared birthdays, shared schoolyards, shared secrets. Maybe in Louzell Davis' grief-stricken mind, that bond made Jacob guilty by association. Maybe it wasn't logic that drove him to that porch. It was pain. When a parent loses a child so suddenly, so violently, the world stopped making sense. And the wreckage of that loss, Davis didn't look for answers. He looked for someone to blame. And on that December afternoon, he chose Jacob. In just 24 hours, two families were torn apart. One buried his son lost to gunfire in a moment of chaos. The other watched their child become a victim in a moment of cold revenge. But at the center of it all was Jacob Ashford, a boy with rhythm in his step and music in his soul. He wasn't involved in street war. He was a kid, 14 years old, still figuring out who he was, still believing he had time to become someone. But time wasn't on his side. What happened on that porch wasn't random. It was personal, calculated, driven by grief, and fueled by rage. And in the end, it reminds us of something we all try to forget. That sometimes the pain of losing a child just doesn't break a person. It breaks everything around them. Jacob Ashford should have had years ahead of him, laughter to share, dances left to dance. But instead, all is left is silence and a question that still echoes through a grieving mother's heart. Why my child? Thank you for watching this episode of Dead Speaks. If you found this story powerful, please like, share, and subscribe for more cases that deserve to be remembered. And as always, stay safe and stay curious.